What up, guys? Jesse from Mad Naps here, and today we're going to be talking about different UFC champions and greatness and why they're not recognized sometimes until a lot of the time until it's too late. So obviously I have a picture of Stipe. I think he's a good example of one of these guys. But we'll go over a couple different guys and discuss why I think it is. First off, we'll start with Tim Sylvia. Tim, I think he is third most for title wins ever in UFC heavyweight history, behind just Stipe and Randy Couture. Randy obviously gets a lot of respect, despite his record of 19-11, just because he deserves it. Like, out of those 11 losses, I think only one of them wasn't in a world championship bout. He's always fought the top guys, probably the toughest, deepest resume of anyone, the least padded fight record of probably any fighter of all time. So obviously Randy gets the respect he deserves, but Tim doesn't seem to get a lot of respect, and I think there's multiple reasons for that. One is when he ruled over the UFC, the lineal title was outside of the UFC. It was in Pride at the time with Fedor. So even though he was the UFC champion, he technically wasn't the world heavyweight champion, which a lot of people, because of that, they don't give him as much respect, which I do understand is understandable to a certain degree, which comes down to should it be more important to be the UFC champion or the lineal champion? And I think they both have different importances. The UFC has been historically the deepest talent pool. Even during the Pride days, the Pride had a lot of good fighters, especially at heavyweight, but they also put on a lot of weird, like, gimmicky freak show fights. So if you look at Fedor's record, he did beat a lot of top guys. Like, of the day, he beat, like, Coleman, Arlovsky, Tim Sylvia, but he also was fighting guys like Zulazinho and Hongman Choi, Bob Sapp, and, like, I think he fought Bob Sapp, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, he fought all these guys that were kind of like just freak show fights. So I do think his record is a lot more padded than any UFC fighter. And that's why I think Tim deserves a lot more credit than he deserves. Or deserves a lot more credit than he deserves. Deserves a lot more credit than he gets, because even though he was never the lineal champion, he was the champion in a division that was the most, or in the organization that was the most sport-like and trying to actually create real-world champions, whereas Japan was much more about the spectacle, even though they did hold the lineal heavyweight title at that time. Pride was more about the spectacle than the sport, whereas UFC was trying to be a sport. And he does have a lot of good wins. He's got 2 wins over Arlovsky. He's got... who else? He beat Ben Rothwell. He beat Rico Rodriguez. He beat Gam McGee. A lot of the top guys back in the day, Trey Tillman, Jeff Munson, Brandon Vera, who's now the heavyweight champion. It seems like he had a very good record, 31-10, until Randy took the title back from him. He was tied with Randy for the most title wins at heavyweight. And then, obviously Randy, they were both at 5. Randy got the 6th from that, and then Stipe would go on to tie the 6th. But for a while, he was arguably the best heavyweight ever in the UFC until Randy came back and, put that argument to rest. And I think he's very underappreciated because of that. I think the other 2 things that really affect him is, one, the look. He's kind of awkward, kind of chubby. And then the one time, he obviously did test positive for steroids, which a lot of people don't like, understandably. But I think if you look at, especially back then, so many guys tested positive for steroids. And where, the testing was so shit that, half the guys that didn't test positive were on them anyway. The look, I don't understand why people make a big deal out of that. He was a huge guy for that era. Even now, he'd be a pretty tall heavyweight, but, if you look at the era that Tim became champion, he was the biggest heavyweight around, right? He was, in a sense, he was the Ngannou or the Brock Lesnar before there was an Ngannou or a Brock Lesnar. at least in the UFC. Brock obviously came around in like 2008, so I guess Brock was in the UFC at the same time. But in some ways, you could kind of consider him a proto Brock Lesnar, just like much less athletic. He was just kind of the biggest guy in the division, and that worked for him, right? So, yo, DVA Mechanics, what up? But being the biggest guy in the division, like it definitely worked for him. And I think even though he had that awkward body type, and a lot of people don't really, I think they have a hard time looking past the body type. But look at Tyson Fury. Like Tyson Fury's the best boxer in the world today, and nobody has any problem with that. And he's also got that awkward body type. But I think people will. I think as time goes on, even more recently when the UFC released that "Where Are They Now" video with Tim Sylvia, you could see that like a lot of people have a lot more respect for him now than they used to, and I think that'll continue as more time passes. Another reason is Dana White didn't like him, so Dana has a lot of sway in the media, especially during the not so much now as he used to, but like during the early, kind of Zuffa era. He had a lot more sway. What Dana said was basically law as far as MMA media was concerned, because there really was only MMA media at the time. Mainstream media didn't really cover MMA. It was never going to be on ESPN. You never have these hot takes by like Skip and Shannon and what's the other one, Max and Stephen A. Smith. Like you would never. It was just so rare that the sport was covered in mainstream media that back then that a guy like Sylvia was never really recognized in the mainstream, and therefore, for a lot of it, Dana White's opinion is the opinion that people have of him. But now that's starting to change, which is good. But then, moving on to the second heavyweight I think was underrated, which is the guy we got in the picture right here, Stipe Miocic. I think there's a couple different reasons why Stipe is underrated. One is he's very soft-spoken, and we've seen in this era, you have Conor McGregor, you've got Colby Covington, you've got all these guys that are very much making their money and their notoriety off of being big mouths, and even the guys like Khabib, who are much more quiet, they make their money from beating big mouths. And then obviously, and then there's also the guys that like Khabib and Conor and those guys. They also have the luxury of having an entire nation behind them, which, because Americans are so spoiled with how many champions they get, they really don't rally behind their champions as much, because there's always going to be another American champion. Whereas a lot of these other countries, they really get behind their champions because it might be the only champion they have for the next 50 years. So for them, it's a huge deal. Whereas for the Americans, they don't really rally behind a champion nearly as much because they know they'll have another one next year. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is the 3 title defenses in a row. He did start to get a lot of notoriety, and then obviously the 2 DC fights were pretty big. Or the 3 DC fights, I should say. But really, the 2 rematches were definitely the biggest. Just because, everyone wanted to see, could he come back and do it? And especially the 3rd fight, who would end up winning the trilogy. The Ngannou trilogy will probably be huge for him. And if he's able to come back from that Ngannou trilogy and, wins that 3rd fight, then I think he'll get a lot more recognition, especially by, like, big companies, mainstream companies like ESPN and Fox Sports and stuff like that. But I think the big problem with him, like that he's in, is he's a quiet guy in a division with a lot of quiet guys. There's not really anyone that talks a lot of shit. And yeah, he's kind of overshadowed by other champions in a way because he is the greatest heavyweight of all time, or at least in terms of UFC heavyweights. But they've also got John Jones, who's the greatest light heavyweight of all time. They've got Anderson Silva, just retired, who's the greatest middleweight of all time. GSP, just retired, who's the greatest welterweight of all time. Khabib, just retired, who's the greatest lightweight of all time. Jose Aldo, still fighting, who's the greatest featherweight of all time. There's a couple guys in the mix at bantamweight. You could argue Cruz, TJ Dillashaw, maybe Henry, although I'd argue more Cruz or Dillashaw. They have a little bit more accomplished at that weight class. But they're both still fighting. And then flyweight, obviously, Demetrius Johnson has left the UFC, unfortunately. But so the problem is being the greatest of all time in your division in this era doesn't make you stand out, because quite literally everyone is, right? Like, all the greatest in every division, the greatest of all time is either fighting right now or just recently retired. And that makes it a lot less impressive in a way. And I think there's two reasons for that. One, I think we have a very talented era right now, and then two, obviously the sport's young. So especially in those lighter weight classes that don't have as much history, like featherweights only had 4 champions. They had McGregor, Aldo, Holloway, and Volkanovski. So like all 4 of those guys are still fighting, right? So like by default, those are the top 4 guys all time. And so part of it is the how young the sport is. But I think part of it's also just that there's a really deep talent pool right now. You look at that run that Aldo went on, that'll be in the record books forever. That's going to hold on for a long time. Same with Anderson Silva's record. Some of these other records, like Khabib's record, his 29-0 will probably stay around, but I doubt his 3 title defenses will stay that long. Just because it's although it could, like, on one hand, that's historically been one of the deepest divisions, but on the other hand, it's the less knockout power guys have, the easier in some ways it tends to be to go on a run, because if you can separate yourself in skill from the other guy, and there's less chance of just that freak knockout, then it'll it's just better for you, I guess you could say. Less of a puncher's chance to lose. And you've seen that, generally the smaller weight classes have longer title reigns. Not always. Obviously, Jones and Silva are, in the heavier weight classes, and they have very long title reigns. But honestly, another guy that I think is underrated right now is Jan Blachowicz. So Jan obviously won the title off Reyes and then defended against Israel, which is a really impressive win. Izzy's moving up. I think Izzy's a top 2. Like, I put Izzy only behind Anderson Silva for all-time middleweights. So the fact that Jan was able to beat him when he moved up, I find that insanely impressive. Jan is... There's only 5 guys that have more title defenses than Jan. John Jones, DC, Chuck, Tito, and Frank. So, he's already got that first title defense against a really, really, really good contender. Most of the top guys are moved up to heavyweight or retired. Like, DC's retired. John Jones moved to heavyweight. Gustafsson moved up to heavyweight. Rumble Johnson's in Bellator. So Jan's in a really, really good position to go on a long tear right now. I think he'll get more popular than a lot of these other guys, just because being Polish, he will have an entire nation behind him. Although he is the second Polish champion, so they might not rally quite as much behind him as they did Joanna. But it'll be interesting to see. The video of him getting off at the airport seems to show that there's at least a decent amount of support for him in Poland. Izzy, honestly, I don't think Izzy's underrated. I think most people know how good Izzy is. He's really popular. I think there's multiple reasons for that too. I think part of it's Nigerian, because those 3 African champs, Ngannou, Kamaru, and Izzy, they all like kind of promote each other and like hype each other up. So like anyone that's a fan of one of them tends to be a fan of most of them, or at least Izzy and Francis. There's a lot of people that are kind of iffy on Kamaru because can be kind of cringy when he gets into like his act, but when he's actually being himself, he's a pretty chill dude. Kamaru Usman's another guy that I think to some degree is underrated, although I think he's starting to get more recognition. I think part of it's a multiple of things. I think one thing is the fact that he took that second Jorge Masvidal fight. It was a fight that clearly Jorge didn't deserve. He got smashed in the first fight. I think at least 2 judges had it 50-43, which is 2 10-8 rounds. Like, it was a one-sided beatdown, and then they just Jorge didn't even go fight anyone. Kamaru defended his title against Gilbert Burns, and then the Masvidal rematch happened. So I think there are some, the fact that he did take that match it's a lot less impressive. Like, that's one of the things that kind of annoys me is, like, you see a lot of these guys in the mainstream media, like the guys on First Take and stuff, and they'll talk about that fight as if it's, that second Jorge fight as if it's like this insanely impressive title defense, and it's like, he's probably the worst guy to fight for the title, like Jorge is, in at least 4 or 5 years, right? Like, he got a flying knee on Ben Askren, and that literally just launched him to, like, superstardom. And then he fought a lightweight, Nate Diaz, who I don't even think is top 15 in his own division. And then he got a title shot, right? Like, it's just absolutely insane. No, I am a huge Jorge Masvidal fan. Like, I think, the guy, he's a great fighter, but like, he's one of the few guys where I feel like the media almost gives him too much recognition, right? They view him as a true title contender in the sense that, like, there's a chance he could actually win the title. And I think that's completely delusional. Like, he does have power. I mean, if he caught Kamaru, he could have won the title. But, like, from a technical perspective, he's so far behind most of these guys. They always market him as a street fighter, but really he was a high school wrestler that got into MMA through street fighting. So he doesn't come from a striking background. He does a decent striking, but he's actually from a wrestling background. Yeah, it's just, he's a really, really, really good journeyman. But like, he's arguably the worst guy to get a title shot in the last 5 years. And the media talks about him as if he's, well, I mean, they call him Street Jesus. They literally act as if he's the second coming of Jesus Christ. And it's kind of hilarious, but, I'm a huge fan of his. I'll always watch him fight. I think he's a great, exciting fighter, but I don't think he's championship level material. But I do think Kamaru is underrated. I think, he's already got those 4 title defenses, even though 2 of them are against Jorge. That tied him with Pat Miletich, which puts him in 3rd behind St. Pierre and Hughes. If he's able to get 1 more title defense, then he'll be 2nd for consecutive. And if he's able to get 3 more, he'll be 2nd for total. And if he's able to get 4 more, he'll be 2nd for total title wins. So, what Kamaru does over the next couple of years is going to be really interesting to see, where he ends up on that all-time great list. If he can, get those 3-4 more wins he needs to do to knock Hughes out of that number 2 spot, and then another 2-3 wins after that in order to knock St. Pierre out of the number 1 spot. It'll be interesting to see where Kamaru is. And lightweight's obviously in a weird position right now. Lightweight's kind of interesting because right now I think a lot of the, obviously again, MMA, UFC, young sport, so a lot of the top 10 guys of all time are currently fighting by default because, there's only so many guys that are even retired. Sport's only been around for 28 years at this point, at least the UFC. No holds barred contests were happening in shootout as early as 84, but the UFC specifically has only been around, I guess you could call it Western MMA, Western rules MMA, since 93, even less if you want to wait until the, mixed unified rules. So the division was only established in 2001, so that's 20 years for this division specifically. It was 28 years for the sport in the West. And so, in 20 years, a lot of the original guys are just starting to retire or just recently retired. And yeah, I think right now it's in a weird position because I think Khabib is the GOAT, and he just retired. I would consider Poirier and Gaethje and Ferguson, even there's so many guys right now in the UFC that I think are top 10 all time. Like, I'd put Gaethje, Poirier, Ferguson, Dos Anjos, Pettis, Frankie Edgar, although I guess he's not in the division anymore, BJ Penn, although he's way past his prime and not in the division anymore. I'd put all those guys in the top 10. Benson Henderson, I think, in my opinion, is 2nd best lightweight of all time. I think he's highly underrated. He's probably the best example of a guy that's underrated in this division. I don't think many people appreciated his greatness when he was around. He tied BJ Penn's record of 3 title defenses in a, I would argue, much deeper era, against and the guy he took the title from, I'd argue, is also better. BJ won against Joe Stevenson after Shirk had been stripped. Frankie took it from BJ, and then Benson took it from Frankie. So I think that is a really strong era. I think those guys are all like top 5 of all time, but I think Benson is just highly underrated. He's tied with BJ Penn and Khabib for the record for most consecutive title defenses and most title wins at lightweight. I really don't think Benson gets the props he deserves. I think there's a couple reasons for that. I think part of it is that he's mixed African and Asian, which I think is an awkward position for him because there's nowhere really that they can market him hardcore. They tried marketing him against South Korea. It didn't really work that well. They tried marketing him to the African American community. I don't think that worked that well either. And I think there's a variety of different reasons to that. I think South Korea, it's starting to become less so, especially in the more recent years. But even 10, 15 years ago, when Benson was on top, almost 10 years ago now, South Korea had a lot more racist. Like, you always see those racist ads coming out of Asia, so and especially towards Africans. So the idea that this mixed guy was probably problematic for a lot of them. And then I think conversely with the African American community, there's a certain segment that he would attract, right? There's certain amounts of people that'll be into that nerdy culture thing, especially nowadays. Especially if he came around now, I think he'd be a lot more popular. Had his reign been right now instead of 10 years ago, I think he'd be a lot more popular. And I think a good example of this is Izzy. Benson Henderson in a lot of ways was kind of like Izzy. He was kind of nerdy. Obviously not as slick and flashy, but he was this kind of nerdier guy. And at the time, that seemed to sell a lot less in the African American community, whereas now there seems to be a lot more acceptance of that as guys that are grew up with that stuff are now getting older into their early to mid 20s, late 20s. But yeah, I think Benson's just highly underrated, and there's a variety of reasons. And another reason is the close decisions, right? Obviously, he took the belt from Frankie Edgar. Everyone thought it was such a close fight that warranted an immediate rematch. He defended it, fairly controversial. Everyone thought Frankie won the second fight, or most people thought Frankie won the second fight. And then the Gilbert Melendez fight, which was the fight that his last title defense, was again another very close decision. So I think part of it is because, the way he won the title, and then 2 out of his 3 defenses were close. And then also, what really hurt him was that Nate Diaz wasn't a star yet, because had Benson beat Nate Diaz in 2018, 2019, after Conor had already fought him, and then, his star power would have exploded, but ironically, he beat Diaz, a much better version of Diaz, when Diaz was arguably at his prime, and, didn't really get the recognition, because Nate wasn't as big of a star back then as he is now, but that's unfortunate, Another great guy, doesn't really get much credit, unfortunately. This one more with the mainstream, I would say, than the hardcores. Some of these other ones have been with the hardcores. I think a lot of the hardcores underrate Benson and Tim Sylvia. But I think when the mainstream, probably one of the most underrated is Jose Aldo. In my opinion, it's still the greatest featherweight of all time. Obviously, McGregor knocked him out 13 seconds, 14 seconds, something like that. Great placement of the left hand, just knocked him out cold. But yeah, Aldo, 7 title defenses in his initial run, beat Hominick, Florian, Mendez, Edgar, Korean Zombie, Lamas, and then Mendez again. And then after Conor left, beat Frankie Edgar for the undisputed, or for the interim title before being promoted to undisputed. Obviously he's getting a little bit older. I think he's 34 now. Yeah, 34, which is pretty old for a smaller weight class. Generally, the smaller guys age out of the sport faster. There are exceptions like Floyd and Pacquiao, but they're the exceptions to the rule. Generally, because speed and reflexes are so much more necessary, the lighter weight classes, they tend to age out, and you'll see heavyweights fighting into their 40s and 50s in boxing and MMA, but it's really rare that you see a lighter guy do that. So 34 for Jose Aldo. That's pretty. It's getting up there. And he was the champion in 2010. So you're talking 11 years ago. He would have been 23. Yeah. So he barely gets beat by Jones for youngest champion ever, which is just crazy impressive. And yeah, I just think he's highly underrated. Another one I think that's kind of underrated now is Hen Brown. I think that's because he's gone on kind of a skid after TJ lit him up. But when Hen was at his prime, man, he was on that 32 fight win streak. 32 fights, yeah, 32 fight win streak. Yeah, then he lost to Dillashaw, beat Mitch Gagnon, lost to Dillashaw again, and then he was never the same. Lost to Jeremy Stevens, beat Philip Nover, then lost to Sterling, Keller, Ewell, Sanders, and then just absolutely just fell apart. And I think part of that was also that he moved to featherweight. Once he moved up, he was kind of undersized. You see this. He missed weight his last couple fights. I imagine he just, once he lost the title and lost to Dillashaw twice and realized he probably was never getting that title shot back, he kind of just probably got depressed and fell off the rocker. But I think he's still all-time great. Winning the title against Faber, I remember watching that fight live and just being blown away. And then to go on, defended against Michael McDonald, defended against Eddie Violent, got promoted to the undisputed champion, defended against Faber. I think he's second, or I guess Dominic Cruz and TJ Dillashaw are tied for first, so I guess he'd be third for title wins at bantamweight. Dom has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Dillashaw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, so they both have 5. Brow is 4. So I think he's a top 3 guy. I think obviously, or at least he is for now. Henry maybe could have been, but Henry's probably the most, I would say in some ways, disappointing retirement, because the dude held 2 titles at the same time and then retired, with not really defending them that much. With St. Pierre, he held 2 titles and retired on top, but he racked up 13 title wins or whatever it is in that time. So we've seen St. Pierre's greatness. He's number 1, number 2 all time in terms of title wins, just behind Jones. Arguably the GOAT, easily the greatest welterweight of all time, top 10 middleweight of all time, probably, just based on that title win alone. Whereas Cejudo, he won the middleweight, or he won the flyweight title. He defended it once against TJ Dillashaw, great fight. Won the bantamweight title, defended it once against Dominic Cruz, again, great fight. Honestly, 2 very impressive wins against arguably the 2 best bantamweights of all time at 125 and 135. But we never really got to see him go on that tear afterwards like the other guys. He obviously did get 4 title wins over 2 weight classes, which in pound-for-pound rankings is definitely really impressive. But as far as accolades within one single weight class, it's a lot harder to rank him because, at flyweight, he's, out of 3 guys, he's basically last for amount of title wins, right? And then same with that bantamweight. The only person that hasn't defended the belt is Garbrandt, Jan, and Sterling. But Jan defended against Sterling, kind of has, and Sterling will probably lose it. So, he's arguably, other than Aljo and Cody, he's arguably the worst bantamweight champion ever, and arguably the worst flyweight champion ever. And I don't think that says anything about his skill. I think it's just the problem of him retiring too early to prove anything more than that. Because, Dominic Cruz was able to win the belt, then defend it twice, then lose it although due to injury, he never actually lost it in a title fight. And then come back, 5 years later, win the title back against TJ Dillashaw, and then defend it again. And then he was able to come back and fight again for the title against Henry. Barao was able to win the title against Faber, defended 3 times. TJ was able to win it against Barao, defended twice, lost it to Dom, gained it back from Garbrandt, and defended it again. Garbrandt only touched gold for a second there. Jan so far has only touched it for a second, but he'll probably come back and beat up Sterling and get his gold back. And then Sterling, obviously, the DQ. So, if I had to rank them, I'd put probably Sterling as the worst, then Garbrandt, then right now Jan. But I think if Jan gets 1 or 2 title defenses, that instantly puts him ahead of Henry, right? And if he gets more than that and he's able to actually rack up a couple, then he'll pass Henry completely, which is just, yeah, Henry's kind of, I would honestly say Henry is probably going to end up being, I don't know if he'll be overrated or underrated, because on one hand right now, when you hear him talk, he tends to, I would say, overrate himself in some way because he was able to get the 2 titles, and I think that this happens with McGregor too. And McGregor, he got the interim belt, then he got the featherweight belt, and then he got the lightweight belt, but he was never able to defend any of them, right? So, when you look at McGregor at featherweight, he's arguably the worst champion ever, right? Aldo defended it 7 times, won it back. Holloway won the interim title, then won the main title, then defended it 3 times. Volkanovski's already defended his belt. McGregor won the interim title and then won the title. So, he's tied with Volkanovski for the 2 wins, which is right now dead last. Although Volkanovski's done it more recently and against arguably, I don't want to say better competition because I don't think Max is better than all. I guess Max did beat Aldo, but it's, I would probably put Volkanovski, what he's accomplished at 145 pounds, above McGregor. Obviously not in terms of pay-per-view numbers and cultural importance, but that 22-1 record, beating Jose Aldo, beating Max Holloway twice, beating Chad Mendes. Again, all guys Connor's beat, but just the consistency and the way he does it in some ways is more impressive. Connor will knock guys out, but a lot of the times, the Chad Mendes fight, he was getting his ass beat and then knocked Chad Mendes out, right? Volkanovski beat the shit out of Chad Mendes. So those are 2 completely different fights. Jose Aldo, he went out there and knocked him out really quickly, so we never really got to see the fight. It was literally the first punch he threw. Volkanovski beat the shit out of fucking Jose Aldo. McGregor had problems on the feet and had to take down Max Holloway. Volkanovski was able to go toe-to-toe with him. Close fights, but, he didn't have to shoot and take down Max. So, yeah, I think if you look at McGregor at 45, he's, top 5 by default, but that's only because there's only been 5 champions. Technically 4, because Aldo was twice, so. And then again, when you're looking at lightweight, he's only the second guy to not defend that belt. He took it from Eddie. Arguably didn't even deserve that title shot, right? Probably shouldn't have got that title shot. Khabib probably should have been the number 1 contender since RDA had been champion, right? Since 2015. But because he got injured and then he missed weight, he ended up both getting screwed and screwing himself in a way. The missed weight was definitely his fault. But, Khabib should have been champion was arguably the best guy in the world since at least 2014-15 when he beat the brakes off of RDA before RDA won the title. And, then, again, I think if you look at McGregor at 45, he's, top 5 by default. But that's only because there's only been 5 champions. Technically 4, because Aldo was twice, so. Yeah, I think if you look at McGregor at 45, he's only the second guy to not defend that belt. He's only the second guy to not defend that belt. So, RDA probably had Khabib not been hurt and then not missed weight, Dos Anjos probably never holds the title. Eddie Alvarez probably never holds the title. Conor McGregor never holds the title. Tony Ferguson probably never holds the title. Like, they might have got interim titles, but I guess Tony only ever got an interim title, but they never would have held the titles. And then Poirier and Gaethje, obviously, they held interim titles under McGregor, under Nurmagomedov, so they probably still would have. But, it's I think Conor is, like, and I'm a huge Conor fan. I'm Irish, or part Irish, so gotta represent. But, like, let's be realistic here. He's a guy who got lucky that Khabib got hurt, so he was able to get a title shot before him. Because had he not, he never would have won that lightweight title. And then in the lighter weight class, he beat a young Max Holloway. I think Conor was 28 at the time, 27 maybe. Holloway was like 23. So he beat the younger guy. Good fight, honestly. Probably Conor's, in my opinion, his highest fight IQ fight he's ever fought. If you look back at a lot of Conor's more recent fights, he makes a lot of stupid mistakes. He gets really cocky and decides that he's going to stand and bang with guys once they start hurting him and gets him knocked out. Whereas in the Holloway fight, he just took him down. I think part of that might be because he tried that against Diaz, and Diaz choked him out. But, the Holloway fight was a good thing it's a good fight to go back and watch. He took him down for, I think, the last round and a half, 2 rounds maybe. He part of it was, I think he blew his knee out or something. I'll have to go back and watch it again. It's been a while since I watched it, but he ended up shooting, taking him down, just kind of ground and pounded him, beat him, and yeah, it was a good fight. But and then honestly, probably the best example for this, while we're on the, I guess, subject, if you want to call it, for underrated while they're around, is Demetrius Johnson. I don't think the guy ever sold more than 100,000 pay-per-views. That is sad. He's easily a top 3 fighter of all time. Right? In my opinion, it's Jones, GSP, Demetrius. Went on an absolute tear. He fought for the bantamweight title. Well, he was like super undersized, dropped down to lightweight or to flyweight, goes completely undefeated until Henry Cejudo, which I personally thought he won that second Cejudo fight. I did not think Henry won. Goes to I'm still sad to this day that Demetrius Johnson didn't get more love. One of the all-time greats, and it's just, the fact that I think his record pay-per-view numbers were somewhere around 110,000 is, it's just sad. It's, I think unfortunately goes to show how many, you always get a lot of, like, people, and you'll find them on forums and MMA posts or whatever they are, Facebook posts, YouTube pages, whatever it is. They get, these videos that get millions, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of views, and they'll be talking about, all these different greats, and everyone will say, "Oh, I remember when he fought this guy. I remember when he fought this guy." And it's like, it's impossible that this many of you watched this fight because you didn't sell that. It's like, it's like the Demetrius Johnson in some ways has become like UFC 1. I think UFC 1 only had 80,000 pay-per-view buys, but everyone says they saw it. It's like everyone remembers exactly where they were when they bought the pay-per-view that only 80,000 people bought. And Demetrius Johnson's kind of like that, right? Everyone wants to say they watched him in his prime when very few actually did, because there's a lot of people that, I don't like the smaller guys, they missed out on greatness. And I think they resent that because, you can go back and watch it, but it's not the same as watching it live. And I think once he lost that title and then once he went to ONE FC, they realized what they missed, that, the Demetrius Johnson show is over, and you'd been crying about them being too small for so long that you literally didn't get to see any of it. So, but, I'll leave you on that note.